Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 152. Spring training is well underway, and we are staying busy, but that doesn't mean that the content will be running out. Today, I've got an awesome guest from the orthopedic world, has done some really cool stuff, not just in the clinical realm of seeing patients and creating creative solutions to help them along, but also more recently, he's had some landmark studies in the realm of arm health and the relationship to showcase appearances. So some really important stuff for our younger players here, their parents and their coaches, that shed some insights on how we can best keep our healthy arms, progressing the way that we want them to be. And in particular, how we manage some of those high level arms that really have a lot of arm speed at a young age. And we joke they're often arms that are writing checks that the butt can't cash. So some really good insights from an accomplished researcher and clinician in this show. I think you're really going to like it. Overuse injuries have emerged as one of the biggest threats to players at every level of competition. As an example, at the professional level, ulnar collateral ligament injuries at the elbow alone sideline pitchers for an average of over 17 months. That's a ton of lost development and a threat to lengthy careers. Just as concerningly, though, for youth players, overuse is the predominant mechanism of injury. So what can be done? Obviously, we need to train athletes to be prepared for all the stresses the game throws at them. However, the other side of the equation, recovery, often doesn't get the attention it deserves. Healthy, recovered arms mean you can stay in the game and give your best on the field, and that's where Mark Pro comes in. Mark Pro is a cutting-edge recovery tool that provides all the benefits of active recovery, but without the extra effort, muscular fatigue, or stress to tendons and joints. Players can use Mark Pro as long as needed for exceptional recovery between training sessions or after games. We'll often send Mark Pro units back with athletes to their hotels or even have them use them on team flights. Both easy to use and portable, Mark Pro is a powerful tool that allows recovery anywhere, anytime. Use it while relaxing at home, on the road, or during tournaments. On a personal note, I was originally a naysayer when it came to Mark Pro. However, longtime Cressey sports performance athlete Corey Kluber turned me onto it. He adopted Mark Pro into his post-pitching recovery approach, and it was an integral part of him going out and throwing 200 innings year after year. This led me to experiment with it myself and with more of our athletes, and the feedback was consistently outstanding. Now, just a few years later, you'll see it in every major league organization as part of the routines of some of the most accomplished baseball players on the planet. If you're looking for the same results enjoyed by these athletes, visit markpro.com and use the coupon code Cressey at checkout for an exclusive discount. Again, that's markpro.com, markpro.com, and use the coupon code Cressey, Cressey, at checkout for an exclusive discount. Today's guest received his bachelor's from Boston College and moved on to medical school at the Tufts University School of Medicine. He followed it up with pediatric residencies at Rhode Island Hospital and Brown University, and then completed a fellowship in primary care sports medicine at Boston Children's Hospital. With 41 peer-reviewed publications to his credit, his research interests include injury prevention in youth sports, throwing injuries, and sports-related concussion. He's been a team physician at Brown University since 2012 and is an active member of the Pediatric Research and Sports Medicine Society. He's lectured at numerous national meetings on the topic of youth sports injuries. He serves as an associate professor of orthopedics at Rhode Island Hospital and Brown University and is the chief of the Division of Primary Care Sports Medicine at University Orthopedics. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Peter Kriz. Dr. Kriz, thanks so much for taking the time. This is long overdue, and I'm very excited for this episode.
As am I. Thanks again for the opportunity.
No problem. So we started, I think, emailing about this. It was back in the fall when your first study was published in kind of this showcase realm, and so I've been anxiously awaiting the opportunity to see the publication of the second one that I think was equally impactful. But I think maybe a good place to start is, obviously when you go into the world of orthopedics, there's probably a million different directions you can go, but you really got excited about helping young athletes and more in particular young baseball players. What was it that kind of led you down that path?
Yeah, I think it was my first exposure to travel ball with my son when he was in 8th and 9th grade. So that 13, 14, 15-year-old age. And it just amazed me how many overuse injuries that I was seeing and kind of knew what the diagnosis was, but it was really challenging to get parents and their athletes to seek medical attention. The one that really comes to mind is the stress injuries in the lower back, the spondylolysis that I know you're also pretty passionate about too, and can be a real challenging acute and chronic injury to deal with, and particularly rotational sports, but baseball in particular.
Absolutely. So you obviously have this experience, with your own son. What was the most eye-opening part of that? It's one thing to be excited about like a particular industry injury that maybe, obviously has a, a complex diagnostic, picture or something like that. But, for you, there obviously was a personal element to it. What was it about travel ball that, that maybe frustrated you the most
Yeah.
and drew you
So
in the
I
most?
think the thing that was most disheartening was I saw really high level kids that were maybe the early maturers. They were bigger, stronger, faster in eighth grade, but they could generate a lot of power, a lot of torque, a lot of force. But just because where they were in their developmental stage, perhaps their spine wasn't ready to take on that force, and just the overuse. As we all see it, kids are going to the cages sometimes 5 days a week, taking hundreds of swings. And so I literally saw a couple of kids in the batter's box who, and you've probably seen it too, they're swinging, they have pain, they have to step out, and sometimes they just fall. They fall right
Yeah.
to the ground. I had conversations with moms and dads. I said, look, I think this is an injury that you really need to get some medical attention to, and tried to direct them either to myself or obviously some of the clinicians that I've worked with that would act as more of a neutral party. And it was very hard to get them, number one, to stop playing, and to recognize that, hey, this may be an injury that is now acute, but may ultimately be chronic and could jeopardize their son's career down the line. And I think spondylolysis can do that. It really can rear its head later on. And even if you kind of get through the initial treatment and manage them and get their pain under control, they get to higher levels in college ball where they have to generate more force and more exit velocity and more pitch velocity. It tends to be a chronic injury that, in my experience, has sidelined a lot of kids from achieving their dreams.
Yeah. And I definitely I'm going to circle back to that later. Cause like you said, that's something that I think I saw my first one back in 2006, and, it rocked my world. Just, obviously the debated, kind of protocols on whether to brace or not to brace and all that. So, I would love to get your take, but,
Yeah, I'll give.
I
Can I
think
give you a quick pearl?
yeah,
I think
sure.
low back pain in an athlete. We're not talking about a sedentary kid playing video games. Low
Yeah.
back pain in an athlete for 3 weeks, you should seek medical attention because it's a different
Yeah.
animal. And I think with these stress injuries in the spine, early detection probably leads to the best outcomes.
That's a great point, and super consistent with, I guess, I wouldn't call it my clinical experience, but my anecdotal experience. So certainly you're seeing, the stress fractures that's become, right in your wheelhouse, but you're seeing plenty of other stuff. What are the things that are crossing your desk on, the youth baseball injuries the most these days?
Yeah, obviously it's seasonal, right? I mean, it used to
Mhm.
be these overuse injuries we would see mid-season, midsummer, and it amazes me now that baseball has become a year-round sport, and particularly for the throwing athlete. A lot of these kids, unfortunately, are throwing, in my opinion, 10, 11, sometimes 12 months out of the year. So I'm seeing a lot of stress injuries. I'm seeing olecranon stress injuries, in January and February. Just amazing, like fractures on X-rays, not just edema on their MRIs, and just it speaks to the volume and the workloads that kids are now taking on, particularly at younger ages. But most commonly, pain in the inside of the elbow, the medial elbow, and that diagnosis really depends on their age and their level
Yeah.
of skeletal maturity. So in the young kids, it's going to be the little league elbow, where it's the inflammation of the growth plate. But then we can see the avulsion injuries where a piece of bone pops off the medial epicondyle with the flexor pronator tendon and the muscle, and then certainly a lot of just flexor pronator mass strains, but then ranging right into the UCL injuries, ranging from a low grade to a high grade sprain, proximal distal injuries. We're seeing a lot of that. And then on the other side of the elbow, the lateral elbow, we see the radiocapitellar osteochondritis dissecans, the OCD lesions, which are a little bit more chronic.
Yeah.
So that's something where X-ray can really help with your diagnosis. And we're seeing some shoulder instability too, both dominant arm and non-dominant arm. So the position players that are diving back into bags, head first sliding, laying out for line drives, they're sustaining these instability events. They can be subluxations, they can be dislocations, more commonly anterior, but And then with the hitters, we're seeing the batter's shoulder, which is more of a
Yeah.
posterior glenohumeral instability event. But as kids are getting bigger and stronger and generating more force, we're seeing the shoulder injuries just as commonly.
And you're seeing them earlier too. I think that's the scary part is the forces are, they're effectively outpacing skeletal maturity in a lot of these kids.
Yeah, and as you know, as we'll probably talk about in this discussion, it's all about the kinetic chain. You have kids that maybe a couple of their links are strong, but hitting, throwing, it's efficiency right between each of those links, and sometimes you have one that is stronger and more stable than the other, and that really can lead to some difficulty.
Yeah. So, and we kind of alluded to it, but beyond the clinical realm, you've been a very prolific researcher. A lot of scholarly publications, everything ranging from stress fractures in the low back to concussion management, all that stuff. But I think the most recent stuff has certainly been in the realm of, seeing youth baseball injury trends. And you've had two studies published. I think the first one was American Journal of Sports Medicine this past August of 2022. I'd love it in your words, summarize, kind of how you attack the study, what, maybe first, what drew you to investigating this? And then I know that data set also provided, some really, really important insights on a second study. So
Sure.
Let's dig in on it.
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't want to bore you or your readers. So if there's a point where we just get too into the minutia, stop me. But, if we take the 30,000 foot view for risk factors for ulnar collateral ligament injuries and reconstruction, Tommy John, we know what these risk factors are, right? They're pitch counts, they're how many innings you're pitching in a season, it's pitch velocity, it's throwing mechanics, it's your days of rest, fatigue. But showcase participation has been known as a risk factor. Up until our studies, there was pretty limited data. Most of the studies came from survey data, from telephone and internet-based surveys that were looking at showcases as a risk factor. But a lot of that depended on, it was very subjective, right? It was based on reporting from the players themselves, and it really didn't have a lot of objective data. So, getting back to travel ball, about the time my son and a lot of his travel ball teammates were in the recruiting process, we were looking at performance data and a number of the showcase organizations' websites. It's pretty easy to look up. It's public data.
Yeah.
And we were all kind of looking at everyone's players' metrics, and we quickly realized that there was really a plethora of information on pitchers, including elite pitchers, guys that were being drafted in high rounds, detailed dates of their showcase appearances, the pitch velocities, the pitch types. And we had known about John Rogola's Tommy John surgery list that's on the internet. It's a Google spreadsheet from other studies we've done. So where you can get pretty reputable data in terms of when someone tore their ulnar collateral ligament and when they were having Tommy John surgery. So we started thinking about a study assessing the association between high school showcases and UCL injury, particularly in elite pitchers. So we were particularly interested in pitchers that were selected in the top 5 rounds of the Major League Baseball draft, because those pitchers historically have the best likelihood of reaching the MLB level. And we found quickly that 80% of the pitchers in the top 5 rounds of the MLB draft in the past decade, so we studied between 2011 and 2020, 80% of these pitchers had showcase performance data. We realized, hey, we were onto something. We could probably get some good data out of this.
And so obviously you investigate this. I think it was 659 pitchers in all that you scrutinized. And the first thing that jumps off the page is 229 of them. So 27% of them, basically had UCL reconstruction at the time of that surgery. So that's a pretty eye-popping number. And I don't think it was surprising, right? Higher peak fastball velocity really predicted the subsequent injury, which we know that's been, obviously pretty well represented in the research. Is the harder you throw, I think, there was one particular study that showed that every, average mile per hour increase was about a 15% increase in elbow, reconstruction risk. But talk to me a little bit about what you found in terms of the relationships between, showcase appearances and then obviously the longer term outcomes.
Sure. So if we look at the first study, the one that you cited, that was looking at, really we want to know if high school showcase were associated, with UCL injuries in these pitchers. And taking a step back, we're looking at an association here, not causation, but an association, right? So we were kind of interested in a number of different things, and we thought that the high-level pitchers that could achieve fastball velocity thresholds that were in that 90, 92, 95 mile per hour range at showcases at younger ages, we thought they would be more likely to undergo UCL reconstruction earlier in their years or in their careers. And we kind of chose that threshold arbitrarily, but we had done a previous study, Steve DeFroda, myself, in Dr. Paul Fideli in 2017 that we published. And we found that pitchers that had UCL tears had a mean fastball velocity of about 91.7 during the regular season versus 91 in a matched control group that didn't tear. So we kind of knew that ballpark 90, 92 would be a threshold that was potentially significant. And then there was another survey of amateur and pro pitchers that identified 90 to 95 miles per hour as the average velocity pitchers associate with UCL tears. So that's why we kind of chose that 90, 92, 95 mile per hour threshold range in this study. So that was our first hypothesis, that the elite pitchers that could achieve those velocities at an earlier age at showcases, they'd probably tear earlier in their careers. And the second was that we thought that elite pitchers that participated in high showcase volumes in high school would be more likely to undergo reconstruction versus pitchers participating in fewer showcases. So the one thing we didn't prove the second hypothesis. We did prove part of the first hypothesis, that being that the pitchers that achieved fastball velocity thresholds of 90, 92 miles per hour earlier in their careers, they were more likely to have early UCL tears than those that tore later. So, one of the things we found was that the likelihood of undergoing UCL reconstruction increased by about 20% for every mile per hour increase in peak fastball velocity in the showcases. That goes along with some of the data that you reported. One of the unexpected findings that we really didn't expect was that, so the pitchers that achieved a fastball velocity threshold 95 miles per hour at these high school showcases, they actually had a significantly lower odds of UCL reconstruction during the time period that we studied. And we didn't expect that. We thought higher velo, more likely that they're tearing. And it just may be that we've been given this some thought, but maybe they just have such good mechanical efficiency that their energy transfer throughout the chain is just so efficient. They're at a lower risk. I don't really have a good explanation for that otherwise.
One interesting thought I just had as you mentioned that is one of the things that I'm fascinated about, and we've had some of these really, really elite high school arms, kids that win the top couple rounds who, in some cases have pitched in the high 90s, even up to 100. One of the things that's always shocked me is actually how little their throwing volume is. Yes, it's very high pressure, showcase driven, area codes, things like that, but their actual pitching volume, like it's very hard for a kid that throws in the mid to high 90s to go out there and throw 100 innings because there's so much of that summer showcase. There may be like a little bit of like a protective mechanism for the elite guys where they have a very manicured schedule, whereas that kid that throws 91 to 94, who's not a slam dunk, like that's the kid that goes out and
wants to be seen, right? Yeah, I do think there is an element of that, and I think it's piqued my interest and something I want to study more. The challenge here, obviously, this study, I'm jumping around a little bit, but studies like this are going to have limitations, right? You're going to have reporting bias and everything else, and so like it's a retrospective study. This is not a prospective study. You're kind of limited with the variables that you can tease out of the database or the data itself. So you can't look at all of these risk factors that we're talking about in terms of like innings pitched, how many teams you're pitching on through the course of a year, all those other things. So, but nonetheless, it did provide to me like a lot of eye-opening information, particularly looking at the showcases. So we looked at the early versus the late career UCL reconstruction groups within the subset of pitchers that we've talked about. And we found that the age of first showcase, the age they first showcased a slider, and the age that they achieved the 90 mile per hour fastball velocity threshold at showcases was significantly younger in the early compared to the late career UCL reconstruction group. So I think another thing that was really, we looked at trends over the decade. So obviously we collected data for 10 years. And we have in the papers a nice table that really demonstrates this visually. It's hard just to kind of take from verbally from me, but I'll tell you what the key significant findings were. We found that the mean age over that decade from 2011 to 20, the mean age at first UCL reconstruction decreased by over 3.5 years. So mean age initially was about 24, and it's now about 20 years old in this group of elite pitchers, first 5 rounds of the MLB draft that we're talking about. Okay. So the mean number of high school showcases they participated increased greater than twofold during that decade. So the mean of 3 increased to 6 high school showcases per pitcher, basically. The mean age that the pitchers achieved that 90 mile per hour threshold in showcase decreased by about half a year, from about 17.2 down to 16.7 years. And then
that's a big deal. Like 6 months is a giant developmental timeline for a teenage
sure.
athlete.
And then finally, the mean age at first showcase, this is the one that really caught our attention, decreased by about a year, from 16.5 down to 15.6. So kids are now starting their showcase careers as pitchers, particularly at the elite level, under the age of 16, which obviously isn't surprising for those of us that are in travel organizations or have had that experience. I mean, you've got 9U national rankings now, right? So this is what's scary, right? I mean, this is what you're getting into, I think, to some extent. And so, take home points, pitchers are showcasing at younger ages. They're achieving that 90 mile per hour threshold at younger ages. They're showcasing more. The age of first UCL reconstruction is getting younger and younger. So again, there are concerns here. There are a lot of things. I think why showcases matter is a lot of those UCL reconstruction risk factors are there: high pitch counts, high pitch velocities, few days of rest, and fatigue. Right? You go to these 4 or 5 day tournaments, and depending on how many arms you have, how many injuries, you're going to be called upon. And one of the things we'll talk about later is there really isn't a lot of surveillance in terms of pitch count guidelines or even enforcement of if we want to go to Pitch Smart, which is really now for the last 8 years been what everyone's aiming for in terms of medically respected guidelines for reducing arm injuries. There's just not a lot of surveillance and enforcement at the showcase or the tournament level.
I love that you recapped, and as I was thinking about it, I was thinking back to just the number you outlined earlier, that 91.7 in 2017, I think it was. That wasn't far off of Major League fastball velocity. Obviously now it's up over 93, and I was around the hardest throwing team in Major League history last year. Like, there's seriously a giant trend in the velocity development kind of era as the game has become more specialized. But at the end of the day, we're looking at a scenario where we have kids who are skeletally immature, they're underdeveloped, who are able to throw as hard as the average Major League pitcher effectively. Like, it's rising almost along the same path. So it's really a recipe for disaster when we're putting them in more situations. And no one's saying don't throw hard. It's really more of a discussion of at what point should velocity development become front and center, and when should we be kind of pitching to the radar gun at all, if we ever get to that point.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think this gets to the crux of the thing. I'd really like to see there be a velocity trajectory. Obviously, you're going to have that kid who's 15 years old, is shaving, he's 220 pounds, he's 6'4". I don't worry about him. I worry about the 170-pound, 6'4" kid who's a giraffe, who's touching 90, because he doesn't have the lower segment strength in the core to protect his arm, And so, as I get it, kids want to throw hard because they want scholarships and they want bonus money, maybe if they're at that caliber where they can actually be drafted. That's the meal ticket. But why does a 16 or a 15-year-old need to be throwing 92 miles per hour? So they're throwing, they're striking out all the kids in their state, or at least in their conference. Obviously that's going to differ depending on where you're living around the country. And But I don't, I think that's part of this. If we're actually recognizing there are these fastball velocity thresholds that once you cross that, you're in a red zone. I think that's what we need to do is take a step back and say, look, a 15, 16-year-old doesn't need to be throwing 92.
Mm-hmm. We have a kid, I won't mention by name, who trains with us, and he's been very healthy. He literally shot up 6 inches. He was 6'1" at age 14, and he showed up again, and he's 6'7" at age 15. He's 86 to 90. He's exactly what you'd expect, right? Femurs and a humerus that just keep stretching out, muscles and tendons can't keep up. He is elastic as can be. To his credit, he's done a good job of maintaining his mobility, but there's a guy where I sat down and I had a conversation with the family, and I said, what, your training is great, you're taking good care of yourself, but you play by a completely different set of rules. The stresses on you are entirely different than your best friend who throws 76 and hasn't grown into his body. Is you have to manage it differently, and I think that's the hard part about it. Is there's always someone who wants to go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and they want to take that guy, and that's it's a guy who's going to win them some trophies, or it's someone that they can showcase as, look what we built with our program. And in reality, puberty and good genetics, they pick the right parents are what create a lot of that. What you should hang your hat on is when that kid, gets to age 18 and is drafted and without an injury, or, goes on to a good college career and doesn't miss out on development, because that's what's at the crux of this, is beyond just, the actual surgical interventions that take place and all that. But there's a psychosocial aspect to, being hurt, going through all that, and missing a lot of development. People lose sight of how much lower the success rate is when a player has a Tommy John and misses.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I start counseling families about that. Obviously there are a lot of myths. There's still the myth out there that if you tear and you have Tommy John, you're going to come back throwing harder, which is a myth, by the way.
Yeah. And we should have like a quotable here to confirm: the native ligament is stronger than the replacement ligament. Correct?
It is.
All right.
And so I think the what I have started telling families is, look, because I've just like you, we've rehabbed high school kids through Tommy John, and it's oftentimes, if you look at the data, it's 12, 15 months, but oftentimes it can be 15, 18. They're missing 2 seasons. It's essentially twice as long in the recovery as an ACL injury, right? I mean, ACL now, we're not returning kids at 6 months, returning at 9 to 12, because we're finding the risk of re-tear is higher if you go back a little early. But, for all intents and purposes, Tommy John recovery is 12 to 18 months. And psychologically, I've seen kids go through it. It is, I think, one of the hardest rehabilitations I've ever been around. And just trying to keep that kid motivated and busy and just their eye back on. It's so hard to watch your friends at that age playing baseball, and it's the one thing that you love the most that you can't do.
It's a big deal. So the second study, and I should point out, these were both American Journal of Sports Medicine studies. Like, it is not a pushover journal. This is very high level peer reviewed stuff that we can really hang our hat on as important. And they were published in the AJSM both times. So credit to you guys for doing a great job with it. The second study, I think, was probably even more compelling, if not equally compelling. And this is where you actually started talking about career trajectories, where it wasn't just about how to showcase stuff relate to the actual injury rate. It was more about how do they do. And I think that's an equal part of it, because it's a trickle down effect, right? What happens when you do have early Tommy Johns? How does it interfere with your ability to develop? And is it also a sign that you are someone that maybe, I guess, chased the wrong pass early in your career? Instead of learning how to pitch, you learned how to throw a ball 98 to the backstop.
Yeah, no, they're 2 different studies, right? But I think equally important. I think my hope here is that kids and parents read these studies, because I think everyone thinks their kid's going to be different and that somehow you're going to avoid this injury. But there are too many kids, families that are falling into the same pitfalls, and they're maybe not getting the best guidance in this. And again, I'm not here to bring down showcases. I don't think showcase are the end all evil. Just like weighted balls, we could talk about weighted balls. They're tools and they're opportunities, but there are things going on when we have radar guns going on and kids throwing max effort, and depending on the time of the year, all these different things that we were looking at and hoping to determine. But we'll talk a little bit more about this. So the second study, we were interested in what effect high school showcases would have on timing of ulnar collateral ligament tear. So whether it was early, mid, or late career, on the professional careers of elite pitchers. Again, same study group. We're looking at pitchers that were selected in the top 5 rounds of the MLB draft between 2011 and this time 2017. We actually, to avoid lead time bias, what we found is it takes about 4 years from the time you're drafted to the time you first have your first, as a pitcher, your first MLB outing. So we looked at a slightly smaller subset of these pitchers from 2011 to 2017 to allow for that lead time bias. And we go into the explanation of that in the article. So just that's the background. So we were interested in examining how high showcase volumes during high school careers would affect the career trajectory of these pitchers, i.e. their likelihood of reaching the MLB level, but also how timing of UCL reconstruction, whether it was early versus late career, affected their professional careers. So just jumping down to the key results, there were fewer pitchers with early career UCL reconstructions that achieved the MLB level and overall played fewer total pro seasons compared to those pitchers that tore their UCL later in their career.
And just so folks know, define early and late in terms of like how it relates to when they are
Sure.
drafted.
So we did this kind of statistically. We first wanted to know if we were looking at a normal distribution, which the statistics showed we did. So it was a bell-shaped curve in terms of the age at when the pitcher first tore their UCL, okay? And so we used one standard deviation plus one and minus one standard deviation as kind of the cutoffs and used the tails of that. So if you were minus one standard deviation, the age cutoff for that was about 19 years, I believe, and younger. And then for the plus one standard deviation, which was the late, that was about 24 or so. So we looked at those two tails, which overall, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it was between 25 and 30 pitchers in each of those groups for the second study. It was higher in the first one. But we were very interested in those subgroups with some of these results.
I love it.
And so going back to the key results, so we compared the elite pitchers who achieved the MLB level versus pitchers who didn't achieve MLB. Okay, this is all comers. This wasn't the subgroups of early versus late. And so the pitchers who achieved the MLB level were older at their first high school showcase. They were older when showcasing a slider. They pitched in fewer high school showcases, and they had a longer time to tear of their ligament after achieving the 90, 92 mile per hour velocity thresholds. So then we did multivariable analysis. So it's logistic regression. And this is usually what everyone's interested in because it takes what's significant in your univariate results and then puts them into this regression model. And we were assessing the likelihood of the pitchers achieving the MLB level. And we found that pitchers that pitched in equal to or greater than 10 high school showcases, they had half the odds of achieving the MLB level versus pitchers who participate in less than 10 high school showcases. We also found that for every year longer that a pitcher did not tear their UCL after achieving that 90 mile per hour threshold, the likelihood of achieving the MLB level increased by 24%. Then we looked at
that's development right there.
Yeah, and then we looked at we compared pitchers who sustained their UCL tear early, mid, and late career, and the pitchers who sustained late career UCL reconstructions had nearly a 5-fold greater odds of achieving the MLB level. So take-home points here were that maybe we determined a potential threshold for exposures and showcases, maybe equal to or greater than 10. If you surpass that, maybe that has a detrimental effect on your career trajectory. Now, 10 showcases sounds like a lot of showcases, but if you're on a travel team, particularly if you live in Marietta, Georgia, when we were doing this study, it was amazing. The kids in Georgia, man, they just live at some of these complexes during the summer. They're there for certainly more than 10 showcases in a year. We're not even talking about a high school career, okay? So maybe equal to or greater than 10 showcases in high school is that cutoff where maybe you should be careful if you're approaching that as a potential risk. We also found, or one of our take-home points was that the timing of ulnar collateral ligament reconstruction matters. So about 50%, 48.1% of early UCL reconstruction pictures achieve the major league level. So less than half compared to 86.2% who tore their UCL later in their career. So, I think one of the real take-home messages from this paper is when an elite pitcher tears their UCL rather than if they tear matters most as it relates to their career trajectory. And if you can delay UCL reconstruction, you're gonna have the best odds of achieving the MLB level.
Do you think some of this is what kind of I guess allows us to appreciate why in general college draft picks seem to work out better as major leaguers? Is that you think about it, most of the guys that are going to college, there were people that had a window of adaptation ahead of them. They saw something. I mean, Max Scherzer's a longtime client. Max is, adamant that sort of incredibly life-changing money, that high school guys should all go to college, and he speaks largely from the perspective of, the camaraderie, the competition, the maturity, all that sort of things. But, most of the guys that are going to college, in many cases, are the kids that are 86 to 89. They need to find strength and conditioning and optimize mechanics. And then, 3 years later, they're in a much better spot. Do you think that's why we are, as an industry, seeing more success with college draft picks? You very rarely see a high school kid in the 9th round get picked, for slot money who makes it. But then you see all the time these guys who come out of the woodwork and really, really thrive from colleges.
I think so. I mean, just building this database, spending over a year, really diving deep into it. It's pretty clear to me as a researcher that the pathway to the MLB and I can pull up that second study. When you look at, I'll do it right now. I don't have it off the top of my head, but when you look at, there's a table in our study of comparison of pitchers who achieved MLB level and those that didn't. When you look at, so the pitchers that achieved MLB, 71% of them, 72% went to college, where only 56% that didn't achieve the MLB level went to college. So big difference in those numbers. I think scouts certainly know that. I don't think enough parents know that, or maybe high-level pitchers know that too. But I just think when you're looking at, and this is what we're talking about, right, is career longevity, I think. I think it behooves you to stay on a trajectory and not burn out like a shooting star, in your first 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is just the top 5 rounders, right?
Correct.
So there's 15 more rounds, and there's undrafted free agents, and so I think that number is going to skyrocket even higher, just because most of the guys that make it after those rounds are going to be college guys for the most part. You don't see a lot of high school kids signing in the 17th round. It's a very different kind of dynamic there. So to maybe tie a bow on it, big picture showcases, obviously key takeaway, as we know, guys who throw harder are more likely to injure their UCL. That's pretty much slam dunk across the literature across decades at this point. Let's draw out some of the other key takeaways from your 2 studies that you think are the most important, really like take home points for folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can kind of get to this. It's just, I think it's all about risk benefit. I think if you're looking at showcases, so I'm going to back up just for a second. So, you're building, and maybe I'm just an inexperienced researcher. I mean, I've been doing enough of these studies, but I don't do like halfway through the build out of the database a preliminary analysis. I probably should. So, just think about this. We're building this database out of over 800 pitchers. We looked at subsets, but like it took a good 6 months of time doing this, and we had no clue or no idea what our results are going to be. So it's just sometimes you get lucky, but obviously that's why you do a statistical analysis, so that it's more than luck, right? If we're talking about p-values and everything else, or more than chance, right? So I think what I've learned from this, if I were a parent of a high school pitcher who really had a good skill set and really had a chance of playing at the next level and maybe beyond, I would really think twice about signing up for showcases before the age of 16. You know, our results didn't support a moratorium, but it really comes down to risk benefit. And obviously you have to weigh that opportunity to pitch in front of a group of college coaches or scouts. But the flip side is your risk of injury. So, you know, I think twice about that. I think there's a window there where if you're waiting until 16, you should have enough time to, depending on what level you want to play at, still be recruited and get enough exposures. You know, I think a couple things, if I'm counseling patients and parents about showcase participation, particularly for pitchers, I would say try to familiarize yourself with pitch smart guidelines. I think everyone seems to think they know what they are, but there's been plenty of studies that show that people really aren't familiar with them. And it's really a good resource that really a lot of what we're talking about should be predicated on. I think you have to ensure an adequate ramp up prior to participating in a showcase. I would recommend avoiding early season showcases, and we can talk about the regional differences here. Everything seems to revolve around the Southeast calendar. You know, Florida kids are starting high school baseball, you know, what, last week it was? So
I feel like it was a month ago at this point.
right?
We're talking on February 21st.
That's
it's crazy.
Very different from a kid in the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic who isn't going to have their first game till April 1st. So they're ramping up, you know, going to these pro cases and these Southern showcases, and they still have 2 months to kind of maintain that max velocity effort. I think that's a risk factor for sure. I think avoiding late season showcases. So if you're approaching that 100 inning threshold has been put out there by PitchSmart, think twice about going to, you know, an October showcase. I think you can't assume that your travel organization or the tournaments or the showcase organizers are going to really enforce the PitchSmart guidelines in terms of pitch counts and days of rest. So don't assume. And then finally, if you're a pitcher that has shoulder and elbow pain leading up to a showcase event, don't go. I mean, yeah, there's the cost of the hotel and the airfare and everything else, but that pales in comparison to missed time recovering from a UCL reconstruction and just the psychological impact of that sometimes.
Yeah, I think also it speaks to maybe just the importance of creating a calendar, right? And sticking to it. You know, it's very easy to kind of just start adding and adding and adding and not really appreciating how that cumulative stress comes up. But I think you made a great point is, you know, it's make sure if you are going to showcase, you know, do it at the right ages. Nobody cares how you look at age 15, but, you know, if you're going to do it later and put it into part of an overall picture where it's not happening in January when you're not built up. And it's also not happening at the end of October when you're exhausted. It's been a long season and you're ready to go play soccer or football or something like that.
Yeah, there are a lot of variables, right? Because it's you know, just because we've been through it too. Like sometimes you sign up for an organization, like you have to go. If you're a 14U and the rest of the organization's going, then you're going to the showcase too. So I don't think parents and players necessarily have a lot of control over that. But to your point, what really are you trying to see in a 14-year-old at a showcase? You know, and maybe some of these exposures at that key critical point in their development are more detrimental than beneficial.
Yeah. So obviously showcases are really big business, you know, and maybe part of a larger challenging trend of, you know, people kind of selling out for, you know, in some cases the wrong thing. Don't get me wrong, velocity sells and it gets outs and all that stuff. But, you know, sometimes it is people that are putting the carriage in front of the horse. You know, what are maybe some of the specific guidelines that you go through with your parents and your patients, obviously, when you counsel them coming off an injury? Like, you know, how do we change this trend of thinking that we've always got to be go, go, go?
Yeah. I think the hardest difficulty now is the sense of urgency, right? It's a race against time coming off of an injury. Even kids that have had Tommy John. So, you know, there's going to be the surgeon's protocol. And then, you know, and that's maybe not the best example, but let's take a common injury. Let's talk about, you know, a low grade or maybe a partial tear of the UCL, proximal, distal, whatever we want to call it, in a kid, and it's February, right? Because that is a common scenario now. And so when that kid's in your office, we're under a lot of pressure to get an MRI, you know, because you know the calendar is dictated by this injury and to some extent the grade of the injury. And I think that's where we kind of fall into this this pitfall of ordering a lot of MRIs, because you can, to some extent, determine the severity of a UCL injury. But my point with that is, after you get the imaging, there's going to be some rehabilitation. And then there should be an interval throwing program before you're getting back to competitive pitching. And it kind of becomes a negotiation process, right? Everything's a negotiation now, whether it's treatment of spondylolysis, how long you're going to be in the brace, or how long I'll be out. I got this big tournament coming up and I really need to be ready for that. So that's the challenge of practicing sports medicine in this age, as you know. I think we've gotten smarter about it. We've listened to our physical therapy friends and community. We started utilizing more functional movement screens. I'm a big advocate of using two-dimensional video analysis. It's very pragmatic, and where we can identify potential weaknesses or mobility issues in the kinetic chain, and that's really helpful for us to demonstrate to the pitcher or the athlete and their parents, hey, look, there's something here that needs to be corrected. I know you want to be throwing 92 in Florida in 3 months, but we've identified some things here that we really think you need to work on. And sometimes that approach, these kids love information, right? Whether it's Rhapsody, any of these things, hit tracks, they love it. And so sometimes seeing their own video analysis or being able to see, hey, maybe my total arc of motion in my shoulder isn't where it should be. And it starts making sense to them, and sometimes you can get them off of that sense of urgency to get back into a game situation. So I think that's what's kind of evolved. I think most of us that are doing this and treating young athletes and throwing athletes have been going to conferences and listening to, the entire arm care community. I think we're all trying to be pretty cohesive with the assessment, but also, a multidisciplinary approach to it too.
Yeah. And I think we have to be, kind of just led in my next question is, injuries have gotten much more complex. I mean, I saw a kid who had an anterior dislocation of his shoulder throwing a weighted ball. Like that didn't exist, 10 years ago. We've seen guys who have fully avulsed, their lat off the humerus. We're seeing obviously thoracic outlet at all-time highs, whether it's that it's actually happening more or it's being diagnosed better. We're seeing all these crazy things. Has your clinic experience, reflect that you're seeing more weird things than ever before, but also, has it created a scenario where your diagnostic algorithm has changed, where diagnosis has gotten substantially harder? You need more tools in your toolbox to get to the root cause.
Yeah, there's no question. I think if you're really seeing a lot of throwing athletes, it's complex, right? And the differential diagnosis has grown more expansive, particularly in this era of year-round throwing and just performance training. One aside, thoracic outlet syndrome in particular, I think that's a very humbling diagnosis. It's oftentimes elusive. It sees us more than we see it.
Diagnosis of exclusion. Right?
Yeah. And so oftentimes what's nice is you'll have a therapist that says, hey, have you thought about TOS in this kid? And, you're thinking, yeah, or yes, or maybe, geez, I hadn't even thought of that. And that ultimately is the diagnosis. They got a cervical rib or there's something else that you pick up on an x-ray and you're like, okay, now this ties it all together. We talked about common things have in common, the medial elbow pain, which we see all the time, the pressure to get MRI. We just kind of talked about how maybe the diagnostic algorithm hasn't changed much, but just that sense of urgency and the lack of willingness to rest, unless that's my biggest challenge is if there's something that isn't requiring a surgery, that's more of a conservative management, boy, it gets into a negotiation. And that's where I think things break down sometimes. So, it's definitely gotten more complex. And the trend is going to continue as the pitching velocities climb and kids aren't, it's nice to see, I think more kids are understanding the importance of strength training. We could certainly segue into that at some point, but I think, and I always preach this too, that, I know in the South, kids don't really have an off season, but here up North, I really try to persuade particularly pitchers not to pitch and fall ball, do a strength and conditioning program and really address some of these weak links in their kinetic chain, their mobility, their athleticism, speed, agility, mobility, explosivity, all the stuff now that a lot of people like you and can name a number of people in the strength and conditioning community that have really opened our eyes to in the past 10, 15 years.
I love the fall spring split in a Northeast athlete. Finish up fall sport at Thanksgiving. You got plenty of time to do a gradual on ramp of a throwing program to get ready for the third Monday in March. You got time to put everything together. A little trickier when they play basketball and they're going like gangbusters all the way right up to the start of the season. But yeah, it doesn't happen in Florida. It's a very different experience being down here where the calendar doesn't even allow you to play multiple sports. You really have to pick, and honestly, it's too bad. And it, like as you said, it's really hard to see this trend correcting because guys are continuing to throw harder and harder. They're specializing earlier and earlier. I think to some degree the only way it corrects is if we protect them from themselves. The quality of I don't want to say the quality of play is improved because I think we can agree that some of the baseball is actually terrible because it's so much showcase ball and so few fundamentals at times. But I think we are seeing absolutely electric arms, and that's not going anywhere.
Yeah, and I think the tough part not to convince someone is that more is better. I think everyone from particularly the kids, like we have kids that in our strength and conditioning program, they're working out with us 4 days a week, but they're also working out at their high schools at 6 a.m. So they're working out like in the morning and at night. And then they're doing their bullpen sessions and they're throwing, sprinkled in there in the week too. So like that's tough because like, as and I know, rest and recovery really promotes gains, and that's what's tough to get a 15 or a 16 or 17-year-old kid to realize.
And what do you do with these speaking of 15 and 17-year-olds, like what do you do when they have Tommy Johns? I mean that not like in a methodology standpoint, it's collectively, what do we all do when these guys get to pro ball? You heard different perspectives across what the useful life of a ligament reconstruction is. And, what happens when these kids who have a Tommy John at 16, 17 are 28, 29, 5 years deep on a big league career? Do you worry about those ligaments? Is there an element of chronicity that scares you?
Yeah. So you just touched on a couple of different things. So, I obviously in the first study we did where we did that, it's a very provocative table. You'll see it when you look at the article. And by the way, I'm going to provide you for your followers. I've got some links, just a comment here. So the publisher doesn't allow us to make the PDF final copy of the articles available through electronic medium. They're available like if you have an institutional or a personal subscription to AJSM, but they do allow us to make available the original manuscript or the final manuscript that was presented to them. So I have that. It's obviously like in Times New Roman, but it has all the figures in the table. So this is in there, the table I'm talking about. But there's a table in there that really shows the trends, and it has dual y-axes, and so it's got line charts going in different directions. But it really is interesting when you look at that. Just the age at which kids are tearing it, and it's just an inverse curve. It's coming down faster and faster. So, if they're tearing at younger ages, nearly 4 years younger than they were a decade ago, they go and have Tommy John, which allows them to return to play at a high level. So at least for a window of time, they're back to doing what they want to do. The concern, I think, is what happens when that primary reconstruction, their first Tommy John, fails. And Dr. Andrews and his group published, I think, in AGSM in 2020 about the outcomes after UCL revision reconstruction. So the second Tommy John surgery in baseball players, not just pitchers, but position players too. And the results weren't very pretty. Only about half of the baseball players that underwent a second Tommy John surgery were able to return to their previous level of competition. So outcomes for a revision reconstruction are not as promising as the primary procedure. And so other authors have evaluated the revision UCL reconstruction of the second Tommy John surgery in MLB players as well. And of those undergoing the second TJ, the mean time in years between their first and second TJ was about 3 to 5 years. So if you look at that, and then if kids are tearing at younger and younger ages, a subset of those that are able to achieve pro ball are going to be undergoing revision surgery or their second Tommy John earlier in their career. So I think career length for those pitchers that undergo an early career UCL is going to be shorter. And that was really one of the findings we found in our recent publication. So I think you're going to, this should be about longevity. You look at guys like Justin Verlander, who tore at 39, that's
38, I think. Yeah. Give or take.
I think it's, or, Nolan Ryan, another example, right? So like we're not going to see that as much anymore. These guys are going to be on there. The real question, because if you've had 2 revisions, if you had 2 Tommy Johns, I'm not aware of anyone. There may be 1 or 2, maybe not the MLB level, that have come back. Well, I take that. Nathan Eovaldi didn't he? Didn't he have 2 Tommy Johns? So there are a few out there.
Right? Jameson Taillon. There are quite a few that have made it back. There are very few. I want to say there may even be 1 or 2 that have had 3, which is it's just shocking. I know that's been discussed in the past,
but it can't bode well for career longevity, right? I mean, you might be coming back for
4.5 years of missed time, right? Yeah. It's just too long away. All right, so I'm going to give you the magic wand, and you can pick 3 things about the youth baseball dynamic that you can change to keep players healthy. And this may be, what you do with the actual way the game is, I guess, structured, from a calendar year, or the way players prepare, or anything else. What are the adjustments that you make? And obviously let's focus particularly with respect to kind of arm injuries.
Yeah, I don't think I can do it in 3 wishes, but I can name off and rattle off a number of things that I think are important. Some of these are just stream of consciousness, but I think first and foremost there should be less emphasis on achieving velocity thresholds at early ages, 15 and 16, like we talked about. I always tell pitchers, the kids that, the cream is going to rise to the top. You know sometimes at 15, 16 where a kid is heading. Stay on your trajectory. Don't look for the quick gains. We didn't have discussions about some things like weighted balls, and it's a tool. I'm not discouraging weighted balls altogether, but certainly not in young kids, and we could talk about the reason for that. But don't look for quick gains, which typically are going to have high risk reward ratios, right? And trust the process. Hopefully find a good coach, a good instructor, whether you're a pitcher, a position player, and really trust them and their process. Kids need to get off their phones. They need to focus more on their own development. Everyone's looking at everyone else's metrics online, and it's I think we didn't talk a lot about mental health, but that's a big factor in all of this, right? I think strength training has to be integrated into your program for you to succeed at higher levels. And it can be safely done with supervision as early as middle school. I'll give a plug out to Avery Fagenbaum, who's in New Jersey. Hopefully you've read some of the stuff, but he's really trying to get this word out. We've totally disintegrated gym class and gym programs. And, now the trouble is not everyone can afford a strength and conditioning program, so we didn't really talk about this, but, sports have become pay to play, and there's a whole subset of kids that just aren't getting a chance because they don't have the economic means. So other things we talked, more is not better. Rest and recovery promotes gains. I do think there's some work to do to reform the showcase and the tournament system. I think there's some opportunity here for those organizations to work with medical and arm care professionals and communities to enforce these pitch counts and the days of rest. And I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think we should give Pitch Smart a chance. It's been rolled out now 8 years, but it has not been universally adopted or enforced. And I think there's ways that we could look at that and potentially penalize those travel organizations, those coaches that are not in compliance, and really potentially reduce elbow and shoulder injuries.
That's a lot of really good stuff. So I apologize for trying to just funnel you into 3, because there was a lot of really good stuff there. Hey, I want to shift gears just quickly, and I appreciate you taking the time for this. But stress fractures, obviously, spondies, in the lumbar spine, it's a huge business. A lot of people don't appreciate it, but it's a big deal in baseball players. Like I said, I first got exposed to one in 2006. And I've lost track of how many kids that we have trained, while they've been in back braces. And I'd love to get your take on some best practices. So I'll speak from my experience. Sure. They call it the Boston back brace, right? I know
Boston overlapping brace.
Yeah, and I know you've done some great work with Dr. Demoncourt from
Hmm.
Children's Hospital, who was, was one of the doctors that we worked with the
Yeah.
most in my time in Massachusetts. What was interesting to me is when we opened our Florida facility in 2014, coming down here is, it was very standard. Pretty much everybody got braced in Massachusetts. And when we came to Florida, we saw it much, much less. We still would see some, but kids would come in and it was a different kind of methodology. And, I guess I never really had a strong opinion one way or another. I know the research was very supportive of, the bracing helping from a healing standpoint, but I think the concern was always, was there, too much of a functional loss when people were there? Where do you stand on some of this stuff?
So I trained at Boston Children's Hospital. So, there are
Mhm.
camps. There's the brace camp and
Yeah.
there's the no brace camp. And Stan Herring and his group up at University of Washington in Seattle, they're kind of the no brace camp. But most areas around the country are also no brace. And so
Mhm.
it's a challenge. And I think those of us that trained in those types of areas feel strongly about the way, just because that's the method that we learned.
Mhm.
The brace. I can tell you, I'll share a little bit of information. So we're doing a study right now at Rhode Island Hospital and Boston Children's Hospital, where we've looked at all of the active spondies, meaning that there's swelling at the site of the, not chronic injuries, but acute and subacute spondies in the last
Yeah.
5 years, in kind of this advanced imaging era where we've been getting routinely MRIs. Um,
Mhm.
and so we've got almost 1,000 kids in the last 5 years. So, it's basically 200 kids a year with this injury here in the Northeast in a variety of different sports. And, this is not a study that has different arms where there's brace, no brace, but there's certainly there's different lengths of bracing. The work that Dr. Demacourt and others have done, Dr. McKaylee, it's standardly a 16-week bracing protocol, where for at least the
Mhm.
first 12 weeks you're in a hard brace, and then you
Yeah.
transition into a more functional soft brace
Yeah.
with some support at around 12 to 16 weeks. The
Mhm.
difference between the two, the brace and the no brace, is if you're in the bracing protocol, at 4 to 6 weeks into the brace, if you don't have pain with that provocative hyperextension testing, we oftentimes let you back into sport in your brace if it allows it. Okay. Whereas if you're in a no brace protocol, oftentimes those clinicians are waiting sometimes 5, 6 months before they're letting them to return to sports. Now, it also differs, I can tell you just from doing the study, between primary care sports doctors and orthopedic surgeons in terms of the length of the time of the brace.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, for an orthopedic surgeon, it can be a shorter time period, maybe six
Mhm.
to 8 weeks, and then they transition them out of the brace. And I think their overall goal is to reduce pain
Mhm.
and minimize pain, and not necessarily try to get a bony union. And
Yeah.
obviously that's depending on when you first see the athlete. The challenge here is when they have back pain, as we kind of talked about before, that kind of the 3 weeks, which I think is really when you should go in and see someone that manages these
Mhm.
injuries, and not maybe your primary care doctor. But they go to the primary care doctor, or a walk-in, or an urgent care, and they get a script of physical therapy, or they go see their chiropractor, and you're kind of, it's this window of opportunity to correctly diagnose it. And by the time they
Yeah.
ultimately come to some of us, it's 3, 4 months, and they've got a non-union. They have a fracture there, and there's really no opportunity to get the fracture to heal. And that may not be the primary objective of the treatment. It's to reduce pain, get them back to their sport, get them functional. But if there's an opportunity to get bone to bone healing, sometimes that can reduce morbidity later in the condition.
Yeah.
For instance, if you just have a unilateral, a fracture, or early fracture on one side, if you can get that to heal, if you don't, then it increases the risk to some extent that they're going to develop a fracture on the contralateral side at that
Yeah.
same level, if it's an L5, L4
Absolutely.
vertebrae. And then you're looking at slip, right? You're looking at
Yeah.
listhesis and other things. And my own clinical experience with this injury, yours probably as well, is like there's a lot of morbidity with it.
Yes.
It's not just a couple of weeks and you're back doing it. It rears its head a
Mhm.
lot. And I think what I'm learning from at least the data extraction that I'm doing, and then that where we are in the study, is the most important thing is early detection.
Yeah.
And again, a brace can be part of the
Mhm.
treatment protocol, but that's just part of it. A lot of it is the physical
Yeah.
therapy, the core strengthening, addressing the muscle
Mhm.
imbalances if they've got tight hamstrings or tight erector spinae, weak lower abdominals, weak glutes. All of this is part of it. I think there may ultimately be a role for bone stimulators too. That's what some people are looking at. There's not a lot of good evidence suggesting it yet, but I think as some of these studies get done, we'll have a better sense at which tools or what combination of tools improves outcomes.
I think where I've always wrestled with the brace is, what you love about them is they're stupid proof, right? Kids, they really can't get into trouble. It effectively restricts them enough so that, them exacerbating their symptoms is off the table. Obviously that goes hand in hand with a limitation to, certain activities. And, I think they do great when you send them to physical therapy. They get out of the brace a couple times a week and, they're in a safe environment where they can't get into trouble. I think where I've struggled with them is sometimes the return to action is so fast. And if you're in one of those for, 8 to 16 weeks, whatever it is, you see folks, they run differently, or they run with less hip flexion. They don't fully hip extend. They often lose thoracic rotation and the ability to kind of create that hip shoulder separation the way you want it. So, I actually wonder if that's where some of the challenges come from in terms of the ones who do have setbacks, is that it's 0 to 60 really, really quickly the second they take the brace off.
Yeah. I mean, there are certain things we try to do, right? We can do a sports trim, and you can trim the brace down so you can get a little bit better hip flexion and improve a little bit of mobility. But there are also certain sports that I think are easier to kind of go back to your sport in a brace versus not. Obviously, something where there's a lot of extension, like gymnastics, is going to be challenging. But baseball, softball, there's just too much rotational force that's being generated to really do that in a brace. Whereas a sport like basketball, lacrosse, it seems to tolerate a little bit better too. So it's tough. It's a tough sell. There's no question. I think it's a long conversation. When we're diagnosing these kids and talking about a management strategy, it's a 45-minute visit. There's no way to make it shorter. So there's a lot of counseling that goes into it, and just talking about some of the statistics in terms of healing rates and everything else too. But even in the best of circumstances, it can be a hard injury to heal.
Yeah. Maybe a quick aside to that is the ones that we have guys that are pitching in the big leagues who we knew who had spondies in younger ages. And, all the other ones that are on top of my mind, they do very, very well now. It's kind of an afterthought at this point. I do remember there were kind of just years of, they have just those random days of stiffness. It was never like a true, like, hey, I fractured my arm when I was 8 and they put me in a cast and then I was good to go. It's like, they do kind of experience those bouts when you kind of have to counsel them on, like, hey, these are the days to pull back a little bit, just kind of extend the warm up, load less, cut back on volume. And they always seem to do well. It's when they try to plow through it that they often set themselves back.
Yeah, and I think there's a little kinesiophobia with it too. Once they've had it, right, there's the fear of re-injury, and whether or not it's really, the non-union that's causing pain, or it's, they've got a little disc degeneration at the level above or below, or some more mechanical low back pain. It's often, like you said, it's very rare. Sometimes you'll see it like with a chronic spondy, there's a little bit of edema around it or in the pars itself, but it's really hard to sort out and determine whether that's really their pain generator, particularly for the chronic ones.
I'm sure you're familiar with the Soler and Calderon study from the American Journal of Medicine back in American Journal of Sports Medicine in 2000. And they looked at spondy cases in Spanish elite athletes. And I've had this in like my 85 PowerPoints I've done over the years. But what was fascinating to me is they found that 8% of elite Spanish athletes, had a diagnosed stress fracture in their spine. It's 27% of track and field throwers, 17% of rowers, 14% of gymnasts, and 13% of weightlifters. And but they noted that only 50 to 60% of those diagnosed actually reported low back pain, and they estimated that the presence was between 15 and 63%, which is a big range. And I've always said we have to blow this out of the water in the U.S. Right? We have lacrosse, we have hockey, we have baseball. About the only sport we share in common with them is probably soccer and tennis. But probably most simply, like, strength training is far more accepted here than it was in Spain in 2000. If you had to estimate, and I've seen more, Major League Baseball spine, radiology reports than I can count. I feel like there's a spondy, that they didn't even know was there on 75%.
Yeah.
I don't know where your head's at with the numbers. Are these incredibly common incidental findings?
So I am familiar with that Spanish study. There was also just another one that you can add to your PowerPoint, but I did come across a study that 30% of Japanese professional baseball pitchers have spondy. So that, I don't know what year that was, but that was something as well. So very common. You almost wonder to some extent if it's a rite of passage, right? If you are generating those kind of forces, and as you allude to, I do think we know there's a certain age, right? That's that 15, 16-year-old who's going through rapid growth where you got the pelvic cross syndrome going on, and tight muscles, imbalances, everything else. So that's kind of the perfect storm too. But then you throw on to that a kid who's potentially a high-level kid, and just the volume of activity they're doing. And then you throw strength and conditioning, and maybe they're not getting the best supervision with their back squats and deadlifts. And I think that's where I think it is. I think we see a lot of it, and a lot of it is obviously asymptomatic. We'll see it incidentally on X-rays that we're getting for other reasons.
It's interesting. We talked about arm injuries, and then we detoured and we talked about lumbar spine injuries, and here we are finding a commonality between the two. Is don't be an idiot at ages 12 to 16.
Yeah.
Be intelligent, play multiple sports, get into strength training safely, understand how to kind of periodize your calendar so that I steal this line from my business partner Shane, but he always says, listen when it whispers so you don't have to wait for it to yell.
That's a good line. Yeah, we aren't listening to enough whispering. Again, the calendar dictates that so much. It's sense of urgency and not time in the calendar to rest, and that's what's tough, particularly when you look at just a low-grade UCL sprain. We're going to recommend 4 to 6 weeks of throwing restrictions, right? And then hopefully you're not getting deconditioned while you're rehabbing, but then you need to really get back into some sort of an interval throwing program. And that's a tough sell, any time of year, right?
That's very important. So kind of start to tie a bow on this. What's next for you? I mean, you're doing some really cool stuff. Obviously you have your clinical practice. I know you're a baseball dad. You got a million things irons in the fire. Yeah. Like, what gets you excited now? Like, where do you think we need to either build on this research or really take this thing into practice?
I mean, for me, this has really invigorated my interest in injury prevention. I've always wanted to have, as part of my clinical practice, but also as part of my research practice, involvement in forming policy and particularly reducing injury. And so I think there may be some opportunities for me and for a number of us to potentially partner with some of these higher level organizations to potentially act as some medical advisors with some of this. But I don't think we should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think fundamentally I like Pitch Smart, and I just think we should go back to that and say, hey, it's been out for 8 years, but have we really given it a chance? And maybe universally adopt that and try to get some agreement at a higher level, particularly at the tournament showcase level. So I think that's where I'm taking this. I'm someone that likes to obviously do research, but then try to find a way to implement it into public health. And I think that's going to be my next crusade. Both my kids are out of the house now. We're empty nesting, so I've got a little bit more time in my nights. I'm not out as many fields and things. But I think I've got another 12, 15 years in the tank to really try to make some changes and save some arms.
That's awesome. Well, certainly I think we can all agree that we appreciate what you're doing to contribute to the body of knowledge and, keep young arms on the field. That's really important stuff. You have a wonderful social media presence on Twitter. It's Dr. P. Kriz Brown U. And obviously, folks in the Northeast, you're an awesome clinical resource for folks, whether they're dealing with low back injuries, shoulders, elbows, or anything else. So hopefully they check you out. Thanks so much for taking the time. This was really, really good stuff. And I was looking forward to it, and you lived up to all my expectations.
Likewise, Eric, it's a pleasure meeting you and have a tremendous amount of respect for your work. I've read through all your blogs on Spondy, everything. I mean, it's gold. It really is. And I think hopefully other people, obviously you have a big social media presence too, but I enjoy going back into some of your early stuff and digging through it. It's really great stuff.
I appreciate it. Well, keep fighting the good fight, and thank you again
You
for
as well.
joining us.
Appreciate it. Thank you.